The headlines on RT International. A Russian military advisor has died in Aleppo after being critically injured in rebel shelling of a civilian district of the Syrian city.
Considering the negotiations on Aleppo, they're like something out of a mystery novel.
The Russian foreign minister describes ongoing talks with the US as Washington's stance on the plan for Syria appears to change by the week. And a night of violent protests hitting the Greek capital on the anniversary of a teenage boy's death at the hands of police 8 years ago. And out of sight, out of mind. The Pentagon buries a report into wasteful spending, which has seen billions of dollars go straight down the drain. And that's according to the Washington Post. Just turning midday in Moscow. Thanks for joining us on RT International. We do start this hour with breaking news from Syria. A Russian colonel has died after being critically injured by extremist shelling in the city of Aleppo. Colonel Ruslan Galitsky had been serving as a military advisor. He was hit in one of the civilian districts in the west of the city, and he died later from his wounds in hospital. The deadly attack came on the same day that militants shelled a Russian mobile clinic, killing 2 female paramedics. Now, one doctor was seriously injured. He's now been airlifted here to Moscow for further treatment. The attack on the unit was condemned by the UN. The facility had been set up to help victims of the shelling. Meanwhile, Syrian government forces are continuing their advance against militants. According to the latest reports, the main battles are now unfolding in Aleppo's old city. But despite the defeats, extremists are still targeting civilian areas with shells, leaving scores dead and injured. RT's Lizzie Phelan, meantime, has been following the fate of one young boy.
Remember when we told you about a 5-year-old boy, Dia, who was terribly injured last week by rebel shelling?
In the next room down here is that 5-year-old boy, Dia, who we met yesterday, who was suffering from terrible brain injuries as a result of rebel shelling. Yesterday, doctors say that he stabilized, but still in a critical condition.
Back then, the doctors in Al-Razi hospital told us they feared he wouldn't survive. Tragically, we now know that he died.
Over the last 24 hours, the rain of shells on Aleppo has been without pause as rebel forces try to reverse gains made by pro-government forces. Multiple neighborhoods in government-held parts of the city have been hit. A total of 14 were killed yesterday and over 50 injured. Now, the days before that were also very bloody. Now, when you speak to children in Aleppo, they will tell you that they're not frightened when they hear the sounds of explosions and fighting. And that's because the streets where they live and play have become a battlefield, and they're acutely aware that at any minute they could be hit.
On Monday, more kids poured through the doors of both of Aleppo's public hospitals, covered in dust from rubble and blood, as shells poured down on government parts of the city from sunup to sundown. 14 civilians were killed and over 50 injured. Doctors told us these are the deadliest days they've seen in Aleppo since the war began.
This month, we are totally occupied from over 24 hours. And actually, this month is the worst month during this period. Actually, it's very bad yesterday. We have about, an operative theater, about 15 cases major trauma, 3 of them children amputated.
The number of dead threatens to rise, with several of the victims in a critical condition. Meanwhile, mortars, rockets, and so-called hell cannons continue to fall randomly on civilian areas as rebels desperately try to survive the fiercest offensive by pro-government forces yet that ultimately threatens to end their 4-year-long presence here. Lizzie Phelan in Aleppo, reporting for RT.
And while filming in western Aleppo in recent months, our crews have witnessed firsthand the dire plight of children. Hundreds have lost their lives, while many more have been injured in militant shelling. the mainstream media and its coverage of children's suffering apparently depends on which Aleppo district they're living in. Jeff Monsoon takes a look.
When it comes to the horrors in Syria, Western media shows you kids dying in eastern Aleppo.
And what strikes me is we shed tears, but there are no tears here. He doesn't cry once. That little boy is in total shock.
And these images are horrible. I feel for the kids. But what they don't show you are the children suffering just miles away in the same city. Because these kids are dying from rebel fire, and that sort of thing just doesn't suit their agenda.
Meanwhile, U.S. diplomats are sending mixed signals over their willingness to strike a deal with Russia on Aleppo. Washington insists contacts with Moscow are vital to solve the conflict. However, it's just postponed the latest meeting planned between the Russian foreign minister and the U.S. Secretary of State. Guy and Chichikan asked the U.S. State Department for any clarification.
We, the public, are now left guessing what happened to the proposal that Secretary Kerry put forward last week, which, according to the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, would ensure the withdrawal of all militants from eastern Aleppo. Foreign Minister Lavrov said that proposal was in line with Russia's view of the way to move forward, that it would lead to the establishment of normal life in the war-torn city. Secretary Kerry and the State Department have not publicly commented on the proposal, except to say that technical talks were coming up.
These would be technical meetings to follow up on what we discussed today, but we will then see each other again next week at the OSCE, so there's a quick follow-up.
This was last week. This Tuesday, Foreign Minister Lavrov said the U.S. suddenly pulled its proposal.
Considering the negotiations on Aleppo, they're like something out of a mystery novel. On December 2nd, John Kerry asked me to support a particular document passed on to us by the Americans. The document is in line with our stance. The next day, we make a public announcement and suggest arranging a meeting with the Americans. Yesterday, we suddenly receive a message from them saying they're not able to meet tomorrow because they've changed their minds. They're revoking the document, and now they have a new one which seems to bring everything back to square one. Once again, buying time for the militants so they can replenish their supplies.
I went to ask the State Department what happened to the talks and to this reported proposal. Here.
What is the status of those talks? Why were the meetings, as I understand the meetings, certain meetings that were due to happen this week were canceled? What happened?
Sure. I mean, again, we're just not, you know, without getting too much into the details or the substance, we're just not at a point yet where we can say that getting together to have these talks would be constructive. When we get there, we'll do it. And I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to, you know, be mysterious. I'm just saying I'm not going to get into the substance of our diplomatic discussions.
The State Department is tight-lipped about the dynamics inside the administration. I asked its spokesman, Mark Toner, to comment on Foreign Minister Lavrov's suggestion that there are, quote-unquote, apparently plenty of those who wanted to undermine John Kerry's practical steps, he said. But Mr. Toner refused to weigh in on that. It should be noted, this Monday, the U.S. pushed a ceasefire resolution through the UN, which Russia vetoed, citing a pending agreement between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Kerry. One has to wonder, what happened to that agreement? Who did not agree with whom, perhaps inside the Obama administration?
We asked former CIA and State Department employee Larry Johnson why an agreement with Russia remains just out of reach.
I have no doubt that Secretary Kerry, if he talked about it, I think he was sincere in trying to strike a deal. The problem he faces is he's not, doesn't really have the full clout and weight of President Obama behind him. There are others in the Obama administration which have opposed that kind of approach and see that as a sign of weakness. So I think, again, it just reflects the chaotic nature of Barack Obama's presidency. And this goes to the point that You know, Samantha Power is close with Susan Rice and close with Ben Rhodes. So they reflect sort of one camp within the Obama administration. John Kerry reflects another camp. There's also, they have the strong backing of my former organization, it would appear, the CIA, in terms of wanting to continue to support the rebels. But the unfortunate reality is that those rebels tend, by and large, to be radical Islamists, the very terrorists that the entire war on terror that started 15 years ago was supposed to defeat.
Violent clashes between protesters and authorities have taken place overnight in central Athens following a peaceful march marking the anniversary of a teenager's death at the hands of police 8 years ago. Dozens of demonstrators wearing masks threw Molotov cocktails and firecrackers at riot police. Similar clashes also took place in Greece's second largest city, Thessaloniki. Crowds gathered to commemorate 15-year-old Alexandros Grigoropoulos, who was killed by 2 police officers in 2008. Back then, his death triggered the worst riots Greece had seen in decades, and as we can see, emotions there are still strong. Former British diplomat Professor William Mallinson says, couple anniversary emotions with frustration at the government, and people are acting out.
Many more people will be protesting generally, not only about the dreadful murder. I think it's important to recognize that. I suspect that many of the demonstrators will be going against the so-called elites, financial elites of Europe, and will be expressing themselves in that way. It's got a ripple effect for much broader issues. You know, there may even be an anti-Merkel element, for example. Many people are angry at the Germans for suffering from their excessive logic and feel that they've been destroyed by German influence within the European Commission, for example. There is genuine frustration with the whole system here, as there is in Italy, as there is to a small extent in France. And I think it should be looked at in that sort of more international context as well. Because remember that the eyes of the world are often on this tiny country, Greece, whenever there's a riot. Well, of course, because there's a danger of, for them, of Greece leaving the euro.
It is RT International. The Pentagon has reportedly buried a study that exposed $125 billion in wasteful spending, fearing Congress would cut its defense budget. The Washington Post revealed that the country's Department of Defense used almost a quarter of its budget on business and non-military operations, ultimately hoping to cut corners and save money on bureaucratic paperwork. However, it allegedly proposed early retirement packages and widespread cuts and bonuses for contractors. Brian Becker from the Anti-War Answer Coalition described the report as blatant corruption.
The fact that they scuttled this report shows that above all else, U.S. military spending and the phenomena of militarism is really incentivized by corporations that make money and by bureaucrats within the U.S. military who also garner great privilege and authority and power within the U.S. body politic. It's a toxic mixture of greed and privilege. It is a dominant part of the way the U.S. government works. It's really a form of corruption. The power of the military-industrial congressional complex is so great, and the profits are so great, that each study and each effort to reform and to reduce military spending ultimately is put into the garbage because, of course, so many of these forces profit from it.
It's RT International. Good to have you with us today. A busy day for news to come your way. Germany's Angela Merkel showing off some fancy footwork as she starts changing her tune on migrants. Well, an election is just around the corner. We'll do the story in just a moment.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight. Give it to us. Redacted is full-on awesome. The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
They do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
He doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
Well, they're the war hawks selling you on the idea that dropping bombs brings peace, to the chicken hawks forcing you to fight in the battles that they start.
The news hawks try to tell you that celebrity gossip and tabloid murder trials are the most important news of the day.
While the hawks of advertising tell you that you are not cool enough unless you buy their product.
Watching the hawks. Watching the hawks. These are the hawks that we, along with our audience, will be watching.
Thanks for joining us. Angela Merkel says the full-face burqa should be banned in Germany, quote, wherever it is legally possible. Well, there is an election coming next year. Peter Oliver reports.
The last one standing among Western leaders. This was snapped just 7 months ago. Now, gone, resigned, going, and also on his way out. After losing votes in local elections, the Chancellor was keen to try and appease her Conservative base at her party's conference ahead of the 2017 federal election campaign.
Our laws have priority over honor codes, tribal and family rules, and over the Sharia. In interhuman communication, we show our face. This is why the full-face veil is not appropriate and should be outlawed wherever it is legally possible. It does not belong to us.
A far cry from what she's had to say in the past.
We guarantee that Islam can be practiced freely within the German constitution and law. We fight any form of Islamist violence with the decisiveness of our constitutional state.
Mrs. Merkel, who famously once said she would do,
"My damn duty and obligation consists of finding a collective way for this Europe to address the crisis."
Now talking about the refugee influx of 2015, saying it
could not, should not, and will not happen again.
Quite the drastic turnabout from the Chancellor. According to those who quit her Christian Democratic Union Party over Angela Merkel's handling of the refugee crisis, we shouldn't expect too much.
You always have to distinguish between her talk and her action. I didn't find anything where I would say, okay, she wants to change something to the right or to the left. I think she will promise a lot to all sides, but at the end she will remain who she is. It's just a placebo to those within the party who want to have a stricter law enforcement towards the immigration population. I don't think that Germany will see a burqa ban, and even if it will be a very, very limited burqa ban.
Clearly keen not to go the same way as Hollande, Renzi, Cameron and Obama, Angela Merkel has no intention of leaving the top job. But while the Chancellor had in the past defiantly stated about the troubles facing the country,
"We have managed so much, we will manage this."
She now implored her party that
our hearts are beating for Germany and for Europe, and we need to work for that. This means that we have to inspire the people, every individual if possible. This is what I stand for, and this is what I'm asking for your confidence for.
As she looks for a fourth term leading Germany, Angela Merkel knows she faces her toughest challenge to date, and she has changed her rhetoric. But will it be enough to see her through in a world where the establishment which she represents hasn't fared so well at the polls? Peter Oliver, RT, Berlin.
An Irish court is set to rule today on a request to release millions of euros belonging to former Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. This in a case which has been running for 5 years. Khodorkovsky is under investigation for alleged money laundering. with Ireland's fraud police probing the movement of his assets in the country. Meantime, millions of his euros remain frozen. Harry Fear reports.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky will be hoping that today marks the beginning of the end for the freeze on his assets in Ireland. Now, that's not a lot of money for a man who was once Russia's richest man. But nonetheless, his legal team have put forward this argument that he shouldn't be regarded as a suspect in Ireland, nor have his assets frozen any longer, because his convictions in Russia have always been seen in the West as politically motivated, with him having been regarded there as a political prisoner. Well, RT sought comment on this case, specifically on what are Khodorkovsky's chances. Take a listen.
I think if he's able to prove where the money came from and that it's legitimate, then there ought to be no reason why it should be released. But if he can't do that, I don't see the money being released, and I think that that would affect his reputation in a harmful way. I think the idea of the Irish Republic being a lapdog is ridiculous. It's a figment of Western European media. And of course, Mr. Khodorkovsky is well known for having quite a lot of paid-for websites and public relations experts who work for him. I don't think the Irish Republic are doing anything other than what is correct.
So it's quite a big day for the former oil tycoon. Certainly his lawyers' eyes will be on Ireland this morning then, as the fraud ruling is expected to be announced.
Well, such investigations are nothing new for Mikhail Khodorkovsky. In the late 90s, he became the head of one of Russia's largest oil companies, Yukos, making him one of the richest oligarchs in the country. However, in 2005, he was found guilty of tax evasion, fraud and embezzlement and sentenced to 9 years in prison. In 2009, Khodorkovsky was charged with money laundering and in 2010 given an additional 14-year sentence, minus the term he had already served. However, he was pardoned by President Putin back in December 2013. Let's get to some other headlines now for you in brief. A strong undersea earthquake has rocked Indonesia. Reports suggesting up to 92 people killed. The 6.5 quake destroyed numerous buildings in the region. Of course, it was 2004. Indonesia was hit by a deadly tsunami which killed over 122,000 people regionally and displaced millions. No tsunami warnings have been issued, but we are monitoring that situation. And police have resorted to using rubber bullets and smoke grenades against protesters in Rio de Janeiro. A large crowd gathered outside the Legislative Assembly where new reforms are being debated. Demonstrators started fires and threw rocks. The new Brazilian government, with Michel Temer, implementing further austerity, trying to tackle the severe economic crisis. Well, the brightest minds of business and science have converged on Moscow for a key forum. They're figuring out ways to make the two vital spheres more innovative. Ilya Petrenko reports.
Of course, there's a whole bunch of things required for any country, even as big as Russia, to be a strong international player. And if you underestimate the various resources intended for high-tech development, you're out of the game. And today at the Moscow State University that you can see behind my shoulder, it is a very big day because the most influential people in the country's business, science, and education are getting together to make sure that indeed Russia does stay on top of the game. Now, for Russia's universities, not only the MSU, it is a unique chance to get first-hand experience from the likes of the head of Sberbank, Russia's biggest lender, also the CEO of Gazprom Neft, which is one of the country's biggest oil companies, the president of the Russian railways, and also the head of Roscosmos, which is, of course, Russia's space agency. And later on today, hopefully, we'll get a chance to speak to some of these people, too. I also heard that the organizers have got some surprises in store for the country's most successful high-tech startups. So they are here too. Today, science meets big business, and it's a very big event. Let's see what they'll have to say to each other.
All right, coming up next, a whistleblower special in Going Underground, talking to the director of a film about Edward Snowden. But if you're joining us from the UK or Ireland, discover the first ever boxing club for girls in Pakistan.